While we're doing bathroom stuff, can I get first speaker, second speaker for each team?
All right, so I'm on the government. My name is Ravi, and me and my partner both go by he, him pronouns. And I'm the first speaker, and he is the second speaker.
So you're Ravi? With a B or a V? How do you spell that? Oh, no, I see it. Okay, Ravi.
Can you post it on the chat? Who is on the gov and both the speakers in the order first and second? And same thing for op. That'll be nice.
And then what's the order? Yeah, what is the order for op?
On op, Nora Kiley is going to be the first speaker, and Adrian Turkajev is going to be the second speaker.
Awesome.
And real quick, just for clarification, can we figure out how we want to do POIs this round before we start?
Yeah, sure. We're good with verbal POIs if you guys want to.
All right. So for us, we would prefer if you use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and then if we don't catch you, you can just interrupt.
Okay, awesome.
All right, so is everyone ready?
Could we just wait?
Sorry?
Sorry, could we just wait till Adrian gets back?
Oh, sorry, I thought he was already back. Never mind.
Thank you.
All right, hi guys. Sorry about that. We were good to go.
All right, so now I'll just assume everyone's ready. If you're not, then you can interject. So briefly off time, this is just the affirmation constructive. So 7 minutes, I'll be going over our case. With that being said, time can begin on my next word. Resolution result. This house would be an optimist. Me and my partner stand on the firmest of government or affirmation on this topic. So to clarify the round, we're going to be finding the following definitions for these terms. We're going to be defining this house as a human individual here. Let's remember that we should be defining this house as the constituent body that our resolution is affecting here. That's how this parliamentary debate works. And given that we're looking at the choice to be an optimist or not to be an optimist, then that's affecting every single person. That's a choice that every single person has to make. And so therefore, we should be operating under this general idea of a person's should be an optimist or should they not be an optimist. So that's how we're defining this house for this round. And an optimist we're defining as someone just having a positive outlook on matters. That's pretty basic. There shouldn't be any contention on that. Now, our value we're going to be defining as individual benefits, but more specifically here, we're not limiting this to just a singular individual. What we mean by this is the benefits that every single different individual can get from this topic here. So more on this idea of utilitarianism and net benefits for our weighing mechanism. With that out of the way, let's get into our main points here. Let's start with our first contention on mental health. Now, if there's one thing common amongst people who suffer from depression and suicide and all these other factors, that's a negative outlook on life and a lack of hope. Let's understand that optimism is the complete opposite or more or less antithesis of this idea. And optimism as a general outlook greatly provides solvency on this topic and this issue. Let's understand the impacts of this, because if we're looking at things like suicide, depression, anxiety, when we all have established here that they stem from these ideas of negative outlooks on life and the lack of hope that we see when we don't have optimism, then having a positive outlook on life, being optimistic, directly solves for these issues. So on all of these impacts here, again, we're not claiming on the affirmation that if everyone started being an optimist, we would completely solve suicide. We would completely solve anxiety. But what we are saying is that a positive outlook is directly correlated and causation here to stopping the development of these different things and limiting their spread and their impact. So for all of these reasons, this point should flow over today's round. Let's go over our second contention here about the impact on others. Now, this is a very logical point here. Being optimistic helps others in multiple different facets here. We're going to be establishing 3 on this point here. So firstly, the mental health of others is simply bettered when you are an optimistic person. That ties into our second idea here, that being that you are more likely to be a compassionate person if you are optimistic. Judges just think about this logistically here. When people have a positive outlook on life, they are more likely to be friendly towards others and more compassionate and more helpful, because those are all things associated with having a positive outlook on life. And obviously, our impacts here are quite obvious here. When you're helping others, that's beneficial. But thirdly, the third facet here, that means that optimism creates drive in an individual, for you and for other people. So if you think about something that's positive, or you have a positive outlook on a future happening, then it's more likely to convince you and put drive into you that you can accomplish that you can strive for that, and that's going to affect you, and that's also going to affect other people. So because optimism makes us hopeful and places drive within every single person, then that's going to help them in their future, whatever various different things it could be. But overall, when we're seeing that it's placing incentive for people to try and do things and attempt to solve things, that's going to help them no matter what. And let's get into our third contention here about realistic optimism. So now, let's understand here as a baseline, before we get too in-depth into this point, what optimism is. Right, we already defined optimism as having a positive outlook on matters. But what's crucial and imperative for us to understand in today's debate here is that that's not mutually exclusive to just ignorance and negligence. In fact, having a positive outlook on life can still mean that you acknowledge other lesser negative factors that are happening on different occurrences and in life in general. It's rather about hope as opposed to ignorance in this case scenario. Let's look at a few examples here. Let's look at every single government that's functioning within our world today. Of course, that's not all of them, but when we take a look at government policy in general, that's based and that's predicated on the idea of optimism, about solving the future, about having hope. If you did not believe that you could solve anything in the future, if you did not have that positive outlook, then government policies simply wouldn't happen. You could not function as a government without optimism here. And the impacts of this are quite obvious, as well as our link to the furthering of how our world works and making sure it can continue to do that. But also, let's look at a more minimal example of this, something that I'm sure we can all relate to, of a student studying for a test. If you are a student studying for a test, you can acknowledge that that test is going to be extremely difficult and time-consuming for you to study for. But if you have optimism and you have a positive outlook on that matter, that can help you study for that test. That can create multiple benefits, because that, like we mentioned earlier, creates a drive in you to help you succeed when it comes to that test. If we're looking at a world void of optimism here, one that is more in terms of pessimism or things like that, then that same drive will be non-existent. You will just understand that that test is incredibly hard, but without optimism, there will be no hope and there will be no success consequently. So with that out of the way, let's get into our fourth and final contention of today's debate. That being the harms of pessimism, or ideas that are really just not optimism here, because we're arguing for the use of optimistic outlooks. So the idea here is that even if you have personal confidence in something, preaching a negative outlook on it, which is pessimism here, would only create negative effects. Because one, that's not going to help you, and two, that's actually going to be a detriment to other people. So again, when we on the affirmation or government of today's debate are arguing for the use of optimism, we're simply saying that using optimism is a better alternative than using what other things people can use to view things and have an outlook on life here. And because of the fact that we're seeing that what people often see as the opposite of optimism, which is pessimism in our case, won't have actually any tangible benefits for an individual, then we're obviously seeing that our resolution has been proved on the affirmation side. But let's also look at the fact that things like pessimism or a lack of optimism inherently lead to greater likelihood of things like stress, which can have physical repercussions, less sleep. If you're a student, for example, we can go back to our previous point, that means pessimism. If that means stress and less sleep, you're cognitively not going to develop as fast. All of these impacts for these people that are quite clear here. So if we're going back and looking at all the points we brought up in today's round, we're seeing that this house, which we defined as a human individual, should or would be an optimist, because every human has the choice to be an optimist and the ability to be an optimist. And that was first because optimism is directly causated to better mental health outcomes. Secondly, we looked at the impact on others being positive. Thirdly, how realistic optimism means that you can still be an optimist and acknowledge worse factors. And fourthly, and lastly, the harms of pessimism, or the harms of not having an optimistic outlook. For all of these reasons, we urge a vote on the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay. My time will start on my first word. Okay, let's start right off on framing. The opponent wants to make it very, very clear, like when it comes to like looking at the counterfactual, like what is the opposite or what is like not being an optimist? We would argue that this does not necessarily mean that you are like a pessimist. We would actually argue that the counterfactual to like being an optimist is more like being a realist. You're not actively saying that everything is negative, but instead you're seeing the world objectively, like the goods and the bads, like not seeing through this lens of like positivity. That is also does not mean that you cannot see positives in different situations. You can like look at an example and see, oh, this was really good. And then you can also see something and say, oh, this is really bad. We would argue that like most likely if you're not an optimist, you're going to be a realist and not necessarily a pessimist. With that, let's go into our case. We're going to give you two contentions. Number one is material. Subpoint A is like the big questions debate is like, why do people do things? People fundamentally do things because external motivations to do them. Example, people do debate because they like it or because they want to get into college, because they want a good job, because they want a good life, etc. They want like speaking skills. This is like roughly symmetrical on both sides. So like, what is like really the difference between these two? We would say like, why do you need to actually achieve your goals? There are certain steps you need to take to get something. Example, a job, you can prepare for an interview, etc. We think that on Gov, you are less likely to achieve goals as you're overly confident in what needs to be done to get there. You're overly confident that your resume is good. People are going to like you, etc. You are less likely to take time to prep for an interview because you think, oh, I've already prepped like 5 hours and I'm a good speaker. It's going to be okay. But instead of saying, actually, maybe I should do this a few more hours and actually work to get that job. As a result, you actually do less work like when you're trying to achieve your goals because you're overconfident. Subpoint B kind of goes into like overconfident bias, which is essentially that's like being optimistic leads to like this really overconfident bias. When you generally see things through the lens of things all being good, this contributes to a bias that like people might have like overconfidence. If you believe that the future results are more likely to be good than not, then you develop a mindset of overconfidence. You are necessarily thinking that things will go better, then you have a higher chance of than you actually do. So you may ask, why is this mindset bad? It can actively spread to other facets of your life. You may believe that you have better qualities than you do. You may think you're kinder or better liked or anything that you like, or anything others that you like. Also, this can even extend to other parts of your life too. You can overestimate like your driving abilities, for etc. Like you think you're an okay or pretty good driver, then you get on the road and like get in 5 car accidents. So clearly you're not. So we would say this has pretty tangible impacts on the real world. Your overconfidence like can impact yourself. Like you can think you're too overconfident, go into an interview, do really badly, not get a job. But also this can also impact other people. You could think you're a great friend, but give your friend horrible advice. You could think you're such a nice person, but then like actively be mean and like hurt other people. Contention 2 is mental health. 2 subpoints here. First, like you're let down when things don't go your way. So like as an optimist, you're always looking for like the best scenario. You're believing the best in yourself. So you think like something's going to go very well, but like that's not always going to happen. Like this is the real world. So like why is this actually worse if you're an optimist as opposed to like a realist? You're more likely to expect that something is going to go well, and then you are then more disappointed when something does not go well. This is like quite intuitive, like exact. Subpoint on the yes.
Yeah, so would you believe that optimism is more of a mindset for an individual to have versus a one-time belief?
No, I would say that optimism like infiltrates itself into like all the decisions you make. So if you're going to say it's a mindset, then you also have to see that like when you have an optimistic mindset, you are also just going to like, have every impact that we just talked about. Subpoint B is like on the extremes, you're probably going to get like dissociation. Like if your life is objectively really, really bad, but you keep telling yourself that like things are good, that you're going to be okay, this causes dissociation between how your life is, which you really do have to face, and how you keep trying to view it as good. Let's like look at an extreme example of like you're in a really bad situation, but you keep looking for like the very, very good things instead of looking objectively at like what needs to change and how you need to work to get out of the situation that you're in. Okay, with that, let's go into the Gov case. Their first contention was basically about like mental health. They said that like bad mental health comes from like a negative outlook on life. And essentially we're like, if everyone is like more optimistic, if this house is an optimist, they're less likely to have like mental health issues, like decrease in like suicide, depression, etc. And while judges like these may seem like very big impacts, I'll tell you why that like the Gov does not access this at all. Don't let my opponents tell you that like being an optimistic is going to solve all of these issues. We actually couldn't disagree more. We would first say, turn this. You're going to have worse mental health because you have really high expectations that are being constantly let down. Even if you maybe like believe a tiny bit that you will be in a bad situation and say, let's look towards the positives. Those positives are not going to change your situations. Like looking towards a positive is not going to change the issues that you are solving. Let's see what this is actually even worse. If you're constantly like an optimist and you're constantly looking for the good things in life, but then you're constantly being let down, you're more likely to also be struggling with that. You like, as I talked about with like disillusion, you're not going to understand why everything is going so wrong when you want it to be going right. I would say this would even cause worse mental health issues. Also, like if someone is like super like depressed and others are just like telling them to see the positives, like And that's gonna like make them feel even like worse. Like that's not gonna help at all. And also this kind of talks about like when my opponents tell you like as a friend you'll be better to other people because like you'll be able to like urge positivity and be kind. If you are like an optimist trying to talk to people that are like necessarily not optimists, you're just gonna come off as really annoying and not actually addressing any of their issues. But that's a reputation for like contention 2. So their subpoint beyond contention 1 was about the impact on others and that you actually make their mental health better. I already told you this is gonna make other people dislike you more. If like you're constantly optimistic, you're not actually facing like the real facts of like what their issue is. And you're like, if they come to you like, I have this really bad issue with my friend, and you're like, okay, but like look at the positives, like it could be so much worse, or like etc. They don't want to hear that. People want help actually solving their issues. They don't want you to try to put on rose-colored glasses that they didn't ask for. Also, people being optimistic is not going to necessarily make you nicer to other people. You can see the positives or the good parts of the situation and still go cyberbully people online. There's like correlation, not the cause of anything. Their second contention was drive of an individual. Turn this point too. Like we would say that like you're gonna have less drive because you have less urgency. If you like don't look at like your world like through like how it actually is, the goods, the bad, you're more likely to delay your response. And even then to say I'm gonna take a less response because I'm gonna look at a few more positives here. Like this is actually not as bad as we should make it out to be, etc. That's something that you have less urgency when you actually try to take action. Their third contention was that like realistic optimism. They were like, you can be an optimist and acknowledge factors. Judges, I want you to realize that the more that the government side tries to emphasize this point, then the less impact the gov as a whole side has. If they tell you, okay, you can be a realistic optimist, like you can like look at the goods and also look at what it should be. Great. The op is arguing to be a realist. The more impacts they tell you this, flow that all to the op side. We're telling you, yes, realism is the best way to achieve things. You're actually going to access every single impact directly under the definition of what the op side is. When they tell you, like, you can like look at how things are in black and white, they're conceding that you need to look at things in black and white to actually get anywhere in life. They have knifed their case before this round has really even gone started. And also, like, you can have hope and not be like an optimist. Like, we want to like a really, really big distinction. You can like go into a situation and you're not saying that everything's awful. If something good happens, you're celebrating that good. Like if you're looking at the goods and the bad, you're appreciating both of them. We're just saying that we need to be realistic. If something really great in your life happens, great, you can celebrate that. You can be a happy person for like, and whatever, you can still be happy and appreciate it. But what we're saying is that what you're not doing is you're not disguising and finding the good in bad situations. You're understanding that situation is bad and you're trying to figure out how to fix it. Their fourth contention was that like harms of like lack of optimism. They talked about like students and like stress and like how it's bad to not have optimism. First of all, we would say like you're going to have like more stress if let's say you have like a huge test coming up and you're pretty stressed for it, but you're saying it's okay. Like I already know like unit 1 out of 6 units, like it'll be okay. And then you go and you get an F on that test. Now you're gonna have a lot more stress in the future. We said optimism like when it comes to stuff is not actually good because long-term you're gonna have a lot of worse impacts when you like try to disguise what's going bad. But even on the short term, like if you want to weigh there, on the short term, you're just not gonna do as well. You're not gonna learn the material as well. And while you may have a tiny bit marginally less stress, that's gonna be so much worse when you don't like deal with your issues now and have to push them off to the future. Second, we want to stress that you can still find the joys in life. Even if you're not an active optimist, you can still take moments to not have stress and to like calm down while you're also like actively reaching for your goals. We want to give back to like this framework of like you tell like individual benefits and like individuals to everyone. We say it's better to address your issues head on, enjoy the small positives where they exist, and also address the issues so they don't compound into huge negative long-term effects. So proud to oppose.
Great speech. I'm just going to take a little bit to get sure all my papers are in order. And just like my partner, if you guys have a POI, please use the raised hand feature. And if it looks like I'm ignoring you or I don't see it, you can use it verbally. Okay, so I just want to make sure, is everybody ready? Okay, great. Time can start on my first word. Me and my partner are still on the affirmative affirmation for resolved. This house would be an optimist. So before we actually get into contentions, we need to look at the actual definitions and the laying mechanics for today's round. And just one quick thing, the negation did not actually offer any of their own definitions, so we will be rolling with our definitions. And we need to remind ourselves what the definition for an optimist, which is defined as the positive outlook on matters. And we need to compare this to what the negation states, countering to optimism being realism. but this is fundamentally flawed for a couple reasons, and we'll get right into it. The first reason is that realism isn't actually contrary to optimism. Both of those can exist in the exact same world. The thing that is contrary to optimism is a sense of pessimism. That's the dictionary definition of what is opposite to optimism. You can be a realist while also being an optimist and also being a pessimist. And I'll get into the actual difference right here. The difference between a realistic optimist and a realistic pessimist is that the realistic pessimist states, oh yes, things are either good or things are either bad, but they have a pessimistic view on that matter. A realistic optimist has the exact same thing, where they recognize that something is realistic, but the difference is that they realize in their sense of optimism that we can have a better and positive outlook on this, and that we can actually quantitatively fix these solutions, and we can fix the things that are bad. So with that all that said, we can go into their actual intentions. First, starting about this idea, going back to the BQ questions about just last year, about why people do things, talking about the steps to do something, talking moreover about this idea of overconfidence and overestimate. Well, there's a complete difference from what my opponents actually think optimism is comparatively to what it actually is. They think that optimism is positive reassurance comparatively to when optimism is a positive outlook. You can recognize that something is bad and compare it to just saying, oh, everything's great. But the difference is optimism has a positive outlook, consistently thinking that things can get better and taking those steps to make those things actually get better. So if you're overconfident, as the analogy my opponents used about whether it's your driving abilities, whether it's your test taking scores, all of that, you can recognize still that those are bad. But the comparison between an optimist and a pessimist is an optimist is going to take those steps to get better because they have a positive view on matters. They consistently want to improve and they consistently want to be more positive, increasing their skill, whether it's on driving, whether it's on test taking, or whether it's on, frankly, any matter. That goes over their first subpoint and their second subpoint, moreover, about just overconfidence. They have this analogy about getting a job, but I just quickly wanted to address this analogy. They state that you might be too overconfident for a job. You might think, oh, I don't need to have this actual internship. I don't need to have these specifics to get a job. That's not what optimism is. What optimism is saying, yes, I can get this job, but to get this job, I need to be optimistic and I need to be hopeful. But before then, I can also be realistic, recognizing I might need to do different things, but also being hopeful about those internships, also being hopeful about those applications to proceed getting a job. And secondly, we look at that second point, talking about mental health. And they have this consistent idea of being let down. If you think something good is going to happen and then something negative happens, in their mind, you're going to be sad. That's the difference between an optimist. Yes, you'll be sad every single time in your life something bad happens. But the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that the optimist feels that there is still hope, that things can get better. Comparatively, a pessimist, when faced with that exact same situation, is going to be pessimistic. They're going to feel negative about that situation, and that's going to lead to factors like poor negative health. That's going to lead to factors like suicide, like negative thoughts, like depression, and like anxiety. Comparatively, when you look at optimists, when they are let down in a situation, they keep striving to improve that situation. That's what differentiates optimism between pessimism. Then we can look about this idea of looking between life and reality, and it's the exact same thing. You can recognize that life needs to be improved as an optimist. An optimist isn't just telling yourself, hey, listen, things are great. An optimist is telling yourself, listen, things can always be better, things are going to be better, and having hope about right now and about the future. When you have a, let's say, more than unfortunate life, being an optimist means that you're going to have hope, not just right now, but in the future. If you have really such a bad life, being an optimist is going to make your life better because you're going to take those steps to be better because of your optimistic nature and because you have a positive outlook on life. Now we've gone over their actual case. They didn't have too long of a case, so we can go on to their actual turns and some of their defenses onto our own case, talking about first our point on mental health. And they had the exact same thing that they previously stated. They state that it's going to have a worse mental health because you're going to be let down, because you're going to have false hope. But we just need to remember that optimism isn't something that just only applies for one scenario. You're not going to just have optimism about one event and never have optimism again. When you're talking about being an optimist, that is a mental state of mind. That's something that you consistently have. And having an optimist isn't just going to be about being optimistic about one scenario, it's being optimistic about the next scenario in the future before that. That means that you're going to be optimistic if you fail about getting back up and being and doing greater things in your life. That's the difference between being optimistic and being pessimistic. Then we can look about their impact on others, and they don't actually address some of the things that we talked about. They don't address this idea of ignoring and being more compassionate to other people, and they don't actually address this idea of positive drive. But what they do address is this idea that your friends aren't going to like you, because if you're always optimistic and something bad happens to them, they're going to say, oh, things could be so much worse. That's not what an optimist is. An optimist isn't having positive reassurance and false hope. What an optimist is having hope, but also having a positive outlook while being realistic. So if your friend really does have something in their life that is traumatic or bad, you're not going to say to them, oh, things could be so much worse. You're going to say to them, things will be better in the future, and we can be hopeful that they will be better, and this is how they're going to be better. That's the difference in today's debate. Then we can go on to this first point, the third point about being realistic. We've already touched about this. They consistently think that being the opposite of being optimistic is being realistic. No, that's not the dictionary definition. That's not any definition. And since they didn't provide their definition, they can't alter it in their next speech. What the definition is actually being, moreover, looking at pessimism. So the difference in today's debate is, once again, as I already stated, optimism versus pessimism. And you can be a pessimistic person who does revive and does actually look at realism, the same matter that you can be an optimistic person who believes in realism. The fact is that optimistic realism does not only state, hey, we're being realistic about the world, it states that we can have hope about the betterment in the future of the world. That's why we prefer the affirmation side, because it's not just acknowledging that things are bad, it's acknowledging, hey, listen, things are bad, this is how it's going to get better. Because we have optimism about the future, because we have optimism about the current, and because we're going to have optimism idea. And I don't think I actually have time for your POI. I think I might be in protected time. I'm really, really sorry about that. And then we can finally get into the last point that we have about this harm of pessimism. And they have this analogy that we previously brought up about the test. They state that if you only have maybe 1 out of 6% or any percentage point where you're not really that sure about your test taking skills, you're just going to say, hey, things are going to be all right. No, that's not what you're going to think. What you're going to think is, I could do good on this test. I'm hopeful that I could do good on this test and good in this class, but I need to apply myself to be good in this class. Having optimism isn't just talking about optimism for one thing. It's optimism is a state of mind. And that state of mind is constantly applying itself to be better, not just in one aspect, but in every aspect of life. Being optimistic is being more certain and more actually being applied to for having a better future. And because of this, because we went down all of their contentions and disproved them, and because we mentioned our own contentions and showed why their responses to our contentions don't fundamentally make sense, then we can provide in that today's debate, the affirmation deserves a ballot. Thank you very much.
Okay, sick. So what do I have to say? Okay, yeah,
Wait,
if my
real
wife,
quick, sorry. Can I interrupt real quick? Sorry.
yeah.
I just want one thing on POIs. So for our league, we might do this differently. Is there no protected time at the end of your speech for 1 minute?
There is protected time. I think we just didn't look at the time. That's our bad. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So if I cut out at any point, let me know. If I'm talking too fast at any point, let me know. I'll gladly adjust. POIs out loud, but if not, that's it. I'll start my time on my first word. Okay, so Gov tries to do this really sneaky thing where they basically try and force us into a corner of like, we cannot be realistic, we can't be optimistic, so we necessarily must be like, wow, the world's screwed and everything is going to be bad. Okay, so first let's talk about linguistics and why words are different than each other. And then I have a couple of other overviews, and then I'm going to go into the case. Okay, so they say that we cannot defend being a realist because a pessimist is necessarily the opposite of an optimist. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, it's not a binary. They can be opposites, but that doesn't mean they're a binary. Notice that like on the color wheel, red and blue are opposites, but there's other colors too. Like same thing with like, you can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, they're still independents. Like obviously, sure, there's two extremes, but just because we're not choosing one extreme doesn't mean we necessarily have to choose the other extreme. That's just not how it works. Two, note that being a realist and being an optimist mean different things. The words are linguistically different. They mean different things. An optimist is someone who actively sees things in a positive way. They actively think that something is going to be good. A realist does not do that. They don't see it in an either actively positive or actively negative way. Note that this is different than optimist. Like it's necessarily a different concept. Therefore, if you're not an optimist, it is very much within the realm of possibility that you're a realist. It's very possible that you can not have an actively positive outlook on stuff. You can just have a neutral outlook on stuff. Notice how in this case, A, you're not an optimist because you don't have this like active positive, like sort of positivity that that characterizes optimism, but B, you can also be a realist because once again, you don't see things through any lens and sort of don't have the things that make you an optimist. So now that these things are different, I think the actual question they need to ask themselves is, what is the difference between realism and optimism? And I am ready to grant that there are in certain cases in which there's just not a big difference between the two. Sure, maybe there's a bigger difference between pessimism and optimism. And I think that means that there are certain cases in which there's not a huge difference between realism and optimism, but let's actually talk about the different cases. So what I think is really important to note is that they sort of cherry pick the degree of optimism you have as it suits them. When they're talking about, say, future jobs, they're saying, oh, you're only like mildly optimistic. Like you're like, sure, yeah, maybe it's going to be good and you have hope, but you're such a realist. Like you're not like overly confident or anything. You just have a small, like nice, like little like splash of optimism. And then in other cases, they're like, oh, like you're not going to be depressed because you're optimistic about life. Obviously, these are different degrees of optimism. So let's actually talk about the different levels of optimism. First, let's talk about the sort of very like mild versions of optimism. I don't think this is really important. Like, I really just don't think there's a huge debate here because I don't think there's like a huge difference. Like, sure, okay, like maybe you minorly think that like things are going to be slightly more positive, or you view events as being like slightly more positive, and maybe you get a bit more enjoyment out of that, but maybe you're also a bit more overconfident. Like maybe you think certain people like want to spend time with you and they don't, or like maybe you think something's going to go away your way and it doesn't, and that sort of makes you sad in the moment, right? Like this is also another thing, I'll talk about it later, but like just because you're optimistic doesn't mean you're sad proof. You can still get sad if you're an optimist. If you think something's going to happen and it doesn't happen, you can very much get sad about that. I don't know why they sort of ignore that. I just don't think this part of the debate matters. I think it's really marginal. And I think that like, sure, maybe it can go either way on the margins, whether that like slight sadness you get outweighs the slight happiness you get from being an optimist. I just don't think this is where the like important debate happens, just because the differences between both sides are so slight and so elusive. So let's actually talk about the extreme versions, because this is what Gov is unwilling to confront. The fact that, sure, maybe there's cases in which you're not just mildly optimistic, you're actually actively very optimistic, and that can actually be really bad, right? Because what's the first thing that we continue talking about? The fact that like when you look towards things in the future and when you try and do things, I'm sort of going into the future, if you think they're going to go very well for you, which is more extreme optimism, you're going to do less things to get prepared for them. Like if I'm applying for like if I'm applying for a certain position, I'm like, oh yeah, like this is so easy. Like I'm such an amazing applicant. I have all these things. Like I'm so confident that, you know, this is going to go my way, right? More extreme optimism, then you're probably just going to put in less of the work. Like if you think something is definitely going to happen, then you necessarily put in less work to make it happen, because it's illogical to spend time working on something not necessarily going to happen. If that was a POI, no. If that was not a POI, then say it again. So what does that mean? That means that you actually do get this problem in more extreme optimism. So and that means you also get this overconfidence bias, right? If you're actively very optimistic, you are going to become very overconfident. Why is that? Because Nora actually gives you all this warranting. If you create a mindset where you think things are going to be better than they are, that doesn't stay contained only to say thinking about the future or the past. It's a more general way of thinking that develops that leads to overconfidence, right? And so if you have this extreme mindset, you're going to have more extreme versions of this overconfidence. Their only response is being like, but no, we're going to be realistic. It doesn't really matter. But like clearly in more extreme versions, there is a big difference between the two. We think that's overconfidence why you still get all these problems that Nora talked about, right? You still get the fact that like, oh, you think that you're like this amazing like figure, you think you have, you know, all these redeemable qualities, and you're like, wow, why do people not like me that much? Or like in like the most extreme cases, wow, like I'm such a good driver, like I had 2 beers, but I'm optimistic it's going to be fine on the way home. Like clearly that's bad. That has actual really bad ramifications. It's really clear how the like comparative realism there is sort of isn't bad. Also here the impact of being let down gets much worse if it's more extreme. Like this gets magnified, right? So what do they have in these more extreme versions? They have this very extreme happiness, right? That you maybe get in some cases when you're not being let down. But why do I think this actually doesn't help you? Because I think that I think if you have this extreme happiness you have when you have extreme optimism, it alienates you from a lot of people. Most people just aren't that extremely optimistic that like things are just met and you're like, wow, my life is so good, like everything is great. We think that actually alienates you from a lot of people, because a lot of people, when they connect with other people, look for sort of similar understanding, the ability to understand other people and stuff. We think that if you're so happy about everything and sort of anything happens and you're like, wow, this is so good, and like they're going through hard stuff and they're not actively happy about it, and you can't really wrap your mind around that because you're so extremely sort of optimistic, I think that's a really bad thing. I think it actually makes it harder for you to connect with other people. And also I think that like in extreme cases, it does lead to this disassociation. Like if your life's really good, then it's great to be really happy. And I think you're going to be really happy if you're a realist too, and your life is really good. But if your life isn't really good and you're an optimist and you're really happy, I do think this actually has like non-trivial mental impacts. Like you can't ignore the world around you forever. If you keep telling yourself the world around you is sort of like great, but you realize on some level, like whether it be at subconscious level or not, that it's bad, and you have this like subconscious stress about the world, but this like very conscious like optimism trying to override that leads to a lot of internal conflict, which leads to things like disassociation. This is how mental health works. We think that's bad. And the reason why you think you should care about this more extreme version is just because it matters so much more, right? Like the things we're talking about here, like on the very extremes, like drunk driving, that's not really where this debate is. It's more this like extreme happiness, which actually leads to this extreme like disassociation or being separated from other people. The impacts here are clearly bigger than like the small impacts of being like marginally more happy. So you should actually look at the sort of more extreme ramifications of optimism than the more mild ones. Let's talk quickly about the impact on others. This is the third overview. They say that like if you're an optimistic person, you're just going to make other people feel better. So I just don't think this is true. First of all, I already talked about alienation. Like if you're going through hard times, you want to feel understood. You want to feel like you're not alone. If your friends are just like, no, why are you sad? Like things are well, like it could be so much worse. You don't actually feel understood. You don't connect with them. Also, people want their problems to be solved. That's called being realistic. The last thing here is also like, you don't have to be an optimist to be optimistic for your friend. You can be a realist and still be like, oh, my friend might need some optimism, and act optimistic, say optimistic things, even if you're not actually an optimist. Like you can act optimistic for your friends in either world. Now let's actually go on the case and the couple other stuff that they didn't say. I think that sort of covers most of our case. Most of their refutations here are just sort of being like, oh, realism versus optimism, like they're different. I already talked sort of about that in terms of our first point in doing things. Then in terms of mental health, I already covered sort of dissociation and those things. Let's talk about their case. They talk about how like optimism is not something that only applies in one scenario. It's like a mental state of mind. It's optimism about the future. Sure, but it's also possible to lose your optimism. Like you can still sort of be sad. It's not like a fix all, like you're never going to be sad. You can still be sad if you keep getting let down. For all those reasons and so much more, so proud to oppose.
Okay. Time's gonna start on my first word. All right, a few things in the speech. Start with the framing of the debate, gov voters, op voters, and why at the end of this round, the only box you can be checking on your ballot is an op ballot. All right, let's start with the framing of the space. My opponents get up here and try to tell you the op has to be pessimistic. I'm not going to repeat every warranting that Adrian just gave you on why like that's just not true. So flow that all through on your flows. We're arguing, first of all, just not to be an optimist. We're arguing to be a realist and whatever. We're telling you can look at both the good and the bad of issue. You're looking at realistically. You're not looking through like rose-colored glasses. But fine, even if you at the end of this whole debate and you like ignore all of Adrian's warranting and you believe actually I think the op has to be arguing to be a pessimist, then I'll tell you why we're still winning your ballot under that view. We still access all of our impacts. Let's consider the extremes. For this round to be debatable, you really need to consider both extremes of the situation, or then it gets too similar. If you buy this whole, we can be realistic optimists or we can be optimistic realists, we need to be considering like the extreme to actually have a debate on like why these two are different. We access their impact for these reasons. One, you will see why you need to achieve your goals. If you're a pessimist, you're going to say, okay, this is what's going wrong in my life and this is what I need to do to fix it. You're still accessing like the goals of like everything we're talking about. But what you're also doing is you're still accessing our turns on their points that you're going to be more like driven and you're going to do more in your life. Second, if you buy that optimists can see bad things, then you can also buy that pessimists can see good things. So even if we are pessimists and we have to be pessimists because like you guys believe that the gov has put us in that box, fine. You can still see optimistic things in life and you can still see like why things are also good. Okay, for all of that, let's go into what like gov voters. So what can gov try to convince you that they've won on? Number one, drive and doing good things on life. They can't win this. We turn this in like LO when I tell you that you will have less drive because you're more likely to focus on the positives and escape the negatives. They basically just like don't respond to our turn on this point. They kind of try to touch it and be like, you're still gonna be able to like look at the negatives, but this is not a real like actual like touching it because you're not actually going to be fully appreciating and doing and like actually trying to make changes in your life if you're only focusing on good things. Second, they mentioned like compassion and a drive to be good. You cannot vote here because it is non-unique. You can still be compassionate while being realistic. You're compassionate because you can relate to other human beings, but you never get a warrant as to why you can't do that while being a realist. Second gov voter that they will try to push on you, realistic optimism. This point doesn't win gov the round. Why? Because it's basically trying to combine the gov and the op. They're telling you that you can find the realistic points, conceding that you need to be realistic and that optimism has its downfalls. Judges, one of their contentions themselves is basically saying, let's put a little op in our case. That's basically saying everything that is wrong with their own side. All right, now let's tell you op voters, where can you vote? First place, mental health. At worst, this is a wash in this debate. Both sides have mental health points. We both tell you that there is going to be mental health benefits for our own side. But let me tell you why the op has actually won this point. Gov tells you what? They tell you they're going to basically stall depression. They're going to make other people's mental health better. One, they ignore two of our turns on both of these points. They ignore the turn that one, worse mental health because you have really high expectations. We would argue that the biggest blow to your mental health is really believing you're going to do something and then not achieving it. Two, they ignore the turn that you're going to make others dislike you more. Your friends don't want to hear you say it's going to be okay. Like, I know you're in a really bad situation, but like, look at this one little piece that didn't make everything good. It doesn't. Your friends don't want to hear that. They want something that